Chapter 44, Beneath the Trees. Beneath the trees. Frithia drew a deep breath, taking a moment to enjoy the cool morning. The air was damp and fresh with the scent of the ferns that covered the sloping sandstone cliffs as they loomed in emerald and gold about her. She was seated before Jahara's tent where she had slept the night, but yards from the chattering brook that had likely helped carve that gorge, a stream of stars in the early light. They were a league from the road and 2 from the large town of Halsik, the previous evening finding them clambering down into that verdant gully on the forest's edge to make camp in the relative shelter it provided. The apoggees loomed a dozen yards or so upstream, a wall of trunks upon the ridge above from where a small waterfall plunged from the murky depths, the noisy source to the narrow stream. Her feet were free of their sandals and bathing in the long, dew-drenched grass and, for a few scant moments, Frithia was at peace. Then the anticipated clash of metal on metal came, and the serenity around her was shattered. Behind, the 4th match had begun and she turned to watch Anomen and Valigar exchange the next few blows. The pair had been sparring for the last half hour, trying a variety of techniques in an attempt to bring the best from the ranger's new style. Anomen had lent Valigar his shield for this round, his mace catching it with a plangent clang as he shouted advice.
Yes, hold it steady, but not stiffly, it needs to move as you do, if you are to use it to its full advantage. Good. If you find it effective, perhaps you can get one in Halsik today.
Jahara frowned into the worn bootlace she was rebraiding.
I am still not certain we should be going at all.
She threw a look to Frithia, as though she expected the girl suddenly to change her mind and forbid it. Frithia was tempted. She wasn't exactly relishing the idea of spending a day with only Minsk and Solifane. The pair were hunched together now, Minsk giving instructions to fingers more dexterous than his own as Solifane fixed the trap before them. It was not that she disliked either of them, far from it. But the pair had gone hunting every evening since the rope, an unlikely bond forming between them, and Frithia, as with many things, was left on the outside. She would have liked to blame the essence for setting her apart, giving her some strain of imperceptible disparity for others to sense in her, but in all likelihood she was just useless when it came to keeping friends. Her relations with Imoen were a little mended since the tavern. Oh, they laughed and chatted when circumstance forced it, but there was an awkwardness behind it now that made it all seem somehow false. It was the height of hypocrisy coming from one such as Frithia, but keeping her friend's secret felt like she was endangering them all and betraying Valigar into the bargain. Not that she was exactly close to the ranger, but he had never done anything to her. Perhaps this was how she had been making Solifane feel all that time. The thought was not a pleasant one.
Are you sure you will be all right here?
Continued Jahara, almost hopefully. Frithia sent her a smile that was sure to disappoint.
Course, Minsk has volunteered to play nursemaid to us 2 pariahs.
She glanced to Solifane to see his reaction to their shared exile. He looked away. A crash behind, Valigar cursing into the dropped shield as he ignored Anomen's requests to check over his hand, the commotion drawing Jahara's far more persistent attention. Frithia decided to leave them to it. Imoen had confided to her that she intended to use the visit to Halsik to lighten her rather overburdened pack of many of the books she had brought from Abazigals. She had already read them and made notes by now after all, as her friend had cheerfully explained, a thought that gave Frithia little comfort, though she was still happy to see the back of them. And sure enough, Frithia threw back the flap to the tent the girl shared with Valigar to find the ground sheet covered in books, notes and parchment as Imoen arranged what she was to keep and what could go.
All sorted?
Frithia asked. Imoen nodded her agreement once she had confirmed it was her and swallowed her shriek.
Nearly. I can't believe Vals is actually the one pushing for this. Feeling guilty.
The words had escaped before Fritha had even thought about them. Imoen was scowling, Fritha too embarrassed to offer an apology that they both knew was a lie and finding distraction at her knee. Principles of Summoning, the tome Imoen had bought from Master Omir all those days ago.
The Amma, it seems an age has passed since we left the desert. Well, it's been close to a fortnight,
Imoen answered evenly.
Just think, another may see us free.
Fritha said nothing, letting the book fall open in her lap as the girl continued.
It's all right, Fritha, I'm a bit more wary than I was, but defeating Sendai, it's got to help in some way. It has to bring us a bit closer.
Fritha just nodded, feeling choked by the sudden lump that was burning in her throat. It had rather caught her out, the way her last few 10 days had crept up on her, the desert and her brave proclamations of Sendai's fall and Melisand's end divorced from what it would mean for her. A couple more 10 days, perhaps a month, and she would never sit with Imoen like this again.
Yes, not long now,
Fritha murmured, flicking forward to the front flyleaf to distract from the burgeoning tears. The first page was annotated in Alzito in a neat, scrolling hand, a smile coming as she translated the prose.
Oh look, there's an inscription. To Omir, my once great apprentice and now trusted friend, a small guide to help along the talents of which we are both aware. Do try not to be dazzled by your own brilliance. Master Sanjeet. How nice. I'm surprised Omir parted with it after so long.
Imoen made no reply, suddenly intent on packing up the books about her. Fritha's conscience gave an unpleasant jolt.
Imoen, he did sell this to you, didn't he?
She pressed, her heart sinking when the assurance failed to come.
Imoen, you didn't, tell me you didn't steal this. I had to.
The girl snapped at last, roughly snatching it from her.
I needed to study it and I hadn't the time to translate the whole thing when we were with the Amma. Don't look at me like that, it's not like you've never stolen anything before. Oh Imoen.
And Fritha could say no more than that as the tears she had taken such efforts to swallow began to fall, coursing freely down flaming cheeks. What shame! To see what her friend had become, had been forced to become, following her on this path, and justifying it all with the terrible example of morality before her. Her tears had seemed to have shaken Imoen from her guilty anger though, her friend looking torn between patting her back and just backing off.
Gods, Fritha, what's up with you? All right, I won't sell it, I'll send it back to Omir. Shar's nipples, you're so miserable nowadays. I'm not surprised Sola's tired of it.
Silence swelled in the realization of what she had said, the girl pressing quickly,
sorry, that was. What's happened between you two anyway? Oh, you know,
Fritha hiccuped airily, mopping at her face,
just a disagreement. Did he, you know, try to renew your relations?
In her surprise, Fritha could not suppress the bubble of wet laughter.
No. Gods, no. Solafane wouldn't touch me with the muddy end of Jahara's staff. No.
She sighed, smiling faintly, even considering the source, the laughter had quite cheered her up.
It was just a disagreement. He's working through some personal concerns. I thought it best if I gave him some space alone. Well, no such chance for either of you today,
the girl observed, thrusting the last few books into her bag and placing Omir's tome neatly on the top.
I wish you could come with us to the town, but since you can't, go make up with Sola, the only one with a face longer than yours lately has been him.
Fritha knew this was not so. Solafane's expression had not once wavered from the disinterested mask he had been wearing since the rope. She had been watching him quite closely.
Imoen!
Came the call somewhere outside. It was Valigar.
You ready?
Asked Fritha. Imoen nodded and the pair crawled out into the sunshine, Imoen hauling her bulging bag after her. The others were packed and ready to leave, armed as usual, though their armor had been left off. After previous troubles, they were trying to look as little like mercenaries as possible. The two girls shared a brief embrace before they parted, and Fritha watched them climb out of gully and disappear into the plains above. The two men left just behind her, talking quietly between themselves. The weight of the day was stretching off before her, the groan rumbling through her stomach. At least she had refilled her flask that morning.
"Do you have the map, Fritha?"
She turned at his voice to find Cellophane busy tidying away the tools he had been using to mend the broken trap.
"No, I gave it to Minsk last night." "That she did,"
the ranger confirmed cheerfully, fishing the folded square from his bag. "Here." He opened it upon the lush grass and the three gathered about it. According to a farm they had visited for supplies but a day before, many of the farmsteads and hamlets on that edge of the forest were deserted now, the people either taken or had left of their own accord. Fritha was hoping it was the latter. They were only farmers though, as one bitter laborer had explained, so no one had bothered to investigate further. All the patrols for the area centered in and around the fortified town of Halzik.
"I walked the forest's edge with Bull last night and found recent tracks, but only for those who have entered. If they left again, it was not by the same route."
"If they left," said Cellophane,
"one of the Tethiran patrols sent in perhaps,"
offered Fritha. Cellophane was nodding absently.
"We must be on guard."
Fritha laughed.
"On guard. Patrols. Get it?"
Two blank faces watched from the other side of the map, one unable to see the pun, the other merely unwilling. It was going to be a long day. The bark was rough under her palm, the craggy surface patched here and there in paler lichens. Fritha pushed off from it, trying not to let the momentum take her as she followed that bobbing white head down into the slight dell, the ferns that reached almost to her chest checking her speed. They had walked for a while now, their brisk pace leaving her short of breath. The forest was on the flat overall, but the ground itself was a twisted path of roots and moss, dells and rises hidden by the thick brambles and ferns that could grow in what little light managed to filter through the canopy above. But it was more than the walk that was leaving her breathless. There was a strange life there that was more than just the varied plant life and its accompanying fauna. The forest itself hummed with a primeval vitality, a secret place of lush shadows and shimmering clearings. Fritha felt a reverent hush pressing on her, the girl trying to keep the crash of her passage to a minimum. It did not seem right to break the stillness in so ancient a place, the forest as old as any hand-hewn temple, perhaps older, a shrine of the land from when even the old gods were young. She had been using the stream that flowed past their camp to keep her bearings, but they had crossed and recrossed its meandering course so many times now that, if she became lost, the only way she could likely find her way back would have been to follow it. Ahead of them now, Minsk prowled, moving across the uneven ground with a confident grace neither she nor Cellophane could have managed, even for the man's bulk. He cut a path across another dip, wading easily through ferns that would have drowned her or Cellophane, and it seemed the drow was thinking the same thing. A pace or so before her, Cellophane was picking carefully along the edge of the dell, Fritha impatient enough to catch the retreating Minsk to push roughly through the thick forest of undergrowth on the other side. One step and her knee jerked as the ground reached her foot an instant later than she had expected. Her weight shifted and she was suddenly on her back, tumbling down the steep bank the ferns had hidden. Shouts somewhere above her, it was hard to place them in the crash of her passage, her body breaking a rough path through the ferns. Light was flickering through the leaves ahead, and just as abruptly she was out, tumbling from the thicket into a dry river bed. The water that likely kept it clear in the cooler months was now little more than a muddy trickle, Fritha was rather glad her battered body would not also be forced to spend the rest of the day in wet clothes. The forest looked even larger sprawled down there, ominous and imposing. The trees towered on the fern-covered banks above in a way that made her feel very small and, as much to distract from the sensation as to save at least what was left of her dignity, Fritha sat, and she was still spitting out leaf mulch and brushing dead ferns from her clothes when the men arrived upstream but a moment later. Solafane sighed her name like a prayer, closing the gap between them, and he seemed almost set to reach a hand down to help her, when suddenly he thought better of it, the drow standing back to allow Minsk to crouch at her side.
"Don't fret, Minsk,"
Fritha assured him with a smile, setting her hat back on her head.
"Nothing hurt but my pride, and my entire body,"
she groaned as pain shot all through her back, her head tilted up to try to ease out the crick, and it was then she saw it, a black tangle of legs the size of a man suspended into the branches just above. Slowly, it began to unravel. Fritha choked out the cry.
"Spiders!"
4 black shapes were descending about them. Fritha rolled to her feet, sword drawn ready for the one just above. She took it from the air before it had even reached the ground, a thrust up spattering them all in dark green gore. The remaining 3 creatures were on the riverbed now, circling them, working together to try and corral them into one easy target. Minsk had other ideas. With a roar, the Rashami lunged for the nearest. Its ally leaped in, ready to attack this exposed prey, and Solafane sliced through its front legs to finish it with a stab to the face. The last spider reared back, webs spat into the branches above. Minsk swung his blade about, meaning to cleave it in 2, but it was already gone. With a leap, the creature was in the trees once more, scuttling through the branches to be lost in the canopy. For a moment, they stood, not moving, awaiting its return. Fritha and Solafane sheathed their blades when it became apparent it possessed enough instinct not to try again, Minsk staking his broadsword into the soft earth as he crouched over the nearest body with a deep frown.
"These spiders, they are as the usual greater model back breed, and yet..."
Shouts echoed about the surrounding trees before he could finish, the voices almost lost to the crash of undergrowth. It was only Solafane's immediate action that saved her, his hand fastened about her wrist and pulling her into the bank of ferns after him, and Minsk had barely whipped to the sound before a good half-dozen soldiers were cresting the western bank. A few had drawn their weapons, others leaving them sheathed to better plow through the tangled undergrowth, though all were brought to a halt at the carnage they came upon. One of the soldiers whistled through his teeth, shrilly approving. From her hiding place, crouched beneath a canopy of ferns, Fritha considered how it must look to the newcomers, Minsk standing there in amongst those corpses, broadsword still bearing the dark green gore of his kills, and she was suddenly glad for the ranger's size. If they were to believe such prowess of anyone, it was to be him. The soldier she assumed was their commander was walking down the bank at an unhurried gait, the red horsehair plume on his helm swinging ponderously. He was a tall man of the local coloring with a thick black mustache Fritha suspected he was rather proud of by the way ran a thumb and forefinger over it.
"Well," he exclaimed with a smile, "we had come to lend our blades to the fight, but I see we are not need. Well met, friend, I am Lieutenant Sachem of the 7th. Taith Ryan soldiers,"
grunted Minsk. Fritha was glad the suspicion she heard in his tone had not been noted by the lieutenant.
"Indeed. I and my men were dispatched from Halzik to look for another patrol who went missing a few days ago, while investigating some disappearances in the area."
Sachem looked him up and down, taking in the supple leathers and vibrant tattoos.
"You are a ranger of this forest?"
Minsk surveyed the assembled men with an appraising frown.
"All forests are my home."
They seemed to take that as a yes.
"Well," continued Sachem, "I wonder if you might be amenable to earning a bit of coin. We could use a guide, not just someone who can track, we have enough men here with that skill, but one who can rid the land, too. I've already had to send back 2 soldiers after we stumbled into a hornet's nest. And with far more dangerous creatures abroad.
Fritha watched Minsk weighing the offer, dark eyes flicking to the undergrowth where he had last seen their pair. Next to her, Solafane twitched, but his worries proved unfounded. Minsk knew his course.
Yes, I will do this.
They arrived at the prosperous town of Halzik a couple of hours before high sun. The walk across the plains had been uneventful, even pleasant in the morning's cool without the usual burden of his pack and tent, though Anoman wondered if the rest of the day was to be as enjoyable. He certainly had little taste for markets, and he could imagine Jahara or Valigar having no greater fondness for them than he. The 4 had stopped beside an inn just inside the main gates to get their bearings, their group concealed in the throng that milled before the few stall which had been set up around the nearby shrine to Joaquin. Imoen was positively bouncing at Valigar's side, eager to be into the town proper, while Jahara surveyed the bustle with narrowed eyes.
It is busier than I had thought it would be.
And then she had hoped, considering the woman's tone. Anoman shrugged.
I suppose if other towns have closed their gates, those left open will get all the more trade.
How his father would have laughed to hear him speak so. You could take the man out of
Should we split up?
Offered Imoen, eager to be getting on.
It would be quicker. No,
countered Jahara.
I think we would be safer remaining together. We have not had the best luck with anything more populated than a village of late. Fair enough. How about we go and fetch my books first and then get the supplies last? That way we're not carting them, Abe.
They turned as one as a patrol of 6 soldiers tramped through the gates in formation, people hurrying from their path. Valigar and Imoen were suddenly browsing the stall behind, while Anoman was crouched, fussing over a bootlace. Jahara had ducked into the alleyway just a pace from them, the woman using her vantage to watch the crowds.
Have they noticed us?
Hissed Imoen from the simple clay pot she was examining.
No,
said Jahara,
and they are gone now, but it is good that Fritha did not join us.
A nod to the passage she had just stepped from and the large bounty notice that had been pasted to the side of the inn. Imoen glowered at it with sober loathing. Its presence seemed to have rather robbed the fun from her shopping trip.
Look, trouble or not,
the girl continued briskly,
it will be faster if we split up. We'll probably attract less attention, too.
Jahara paused to consider this logic and sighed her acquiesce when no flaw was found.
All right. You go with Valigar and fetch your books. Anoman and I will get our supplies. Meet up back here by high sun, no later.
And with a trilled,
yes, yes, high sun,
the 2 groups parted. The arcane quarter for which the place was famed was in the eastern area of the town, Valigar and Imoen taking a narrow lane to the bookstalls and alchemists' shops that awaited them. Meanwhile, Anoman and Jahara turned a long wider, and far busier street north for the marketplace, according to a friendly town guard. Even if they had not been told, they likely could have guessed as much. The way was choked with people, some leading handcarts and small wagons, and Anoman found he was being jostled more than usual. Perhaps his lack of armor was helping him to blend into the crowd. He could certainly see the benefit if this were the case, however irritating the result. Barely a quarter hour later, and just when he believed the street could become no more crammed, it opened out onto a large square, several neat rows of bright canopies making a colorful mosaic in the center, while the frontages of the permanent shops lined the edge. People were crowding all about them in a noisy confusion of voices, merchants hawking their wares over the din, the smell of the food stalls mingling unpleasantly with dung from the ambling pack animals. Anoman tried to ignore the comparisons to Joaquin's promenade, scanning the throng to catch on the glint of metal. On a less crowded stall at the market's edge, swords hung upon neat wooden racks, and next to them, Jahara could do nothing but follow as he was suddenly pushing through the throng. The older merchant set down the greave he had been polishing with a welcoming smile.
"Ah, a pearl to you, good sir. You look to be a man who knows how to make use of fine quality arms. Might I interest you in?" "Just browsing, thank you."
If he was disappointed at the dismissal, he did not show it, the smile not wavering as the merchant left them, and Anoman picked up the round shield that had first caught his eye. It was smaller than his own and lighter too, the curved wood likely alder and varnished to a dark shine that matched almost the hue of the stout iron boss. Jahara watched him wade the shield upon his arm.
"I thought we were here for food. What do you think, for Valigar?"
A smile quirked the edge of her mouth, a faint glimmer of approval in her gaze, even as she disputed it.
"I think we'll have enough to be carrying. If Valigar wishes to acquire a shield, then he can come here and fetch one himself."
Anoman snorted.
"You believe he will be given chance to?"
And, for a moment, he fancied they shared the same image, Valigar plodding sullenly after Imoen, his arms piled high with her books as she tripped from stall to stall.
I see your point,"
the woman conceded with a smile.
"Go on then, get it and..."
Behind her, a group of young men had stepped into view and were heading towards them, Anoman's gaze fixed on the blue and grey livery of the silver chalice.
"You pay for it. I have to."
He thrust the shield at Jahara, the merchant noticing their choice to bustle back to them.
"Ah, yes, my lady, you wish to purchase this fine."
Anoman left the merchant to his patter, crossing to the nearest alleyway in 3 long strides and turning to watch the young knights mill about the now haggling Jahara. He was sure they had not seen him, and doubted they would recognize him even if they had, but it was better not to take that chance.
"Oh, your pardon, sir."
He whipped about at the address. The 2 young boys stood in the lane behind him, both taking an involuntary step back. They looked to be barely into their teens and were both wearing the deep scarlet tunics he would have wanted nothing more than to avoid. Oh, Helm, what trial was this? Just as he had feared, the older lad was opening his mouth, recognition slowly dawning in his dark eyes.
"Here, are not you?"
The boy was not given time to finish, everyone's attention suddenly reserved for the larger figure who had just stepped up behind them. The angular features were somehow harder than Anoman recalled them, the pale skin tanned now by many days in those warmer lands, and looking healthy against that red and gold surcoat. Anoman rumbled the name with the severity owed to the owner's appearance.
"Caudrel." "Philip, Sanik," the 2 boys jolted to attention, "await me at the shrine."
The lads hurried past Anoman without a backward glance, leaving the 2 men to watch each other in a silence that crackled with the tension of a decade-long rivalry.
"So, it is true,"
said Caudrel, at last.
"You are still in Tethur. And the Radiant Heart has returned as well,"
added Anoman coolly. Caudrel's narrow nostrils twitched.
"Yes, we are needed here. Rumor has it you gave up the vows you made to the Order to follow a devil who would make this land her hell." "I did no such thing."
To Anoman's surprise, the knight nodded.
"I believe you. As a squire, you were a braggart and an ass, Anoman, but you were not an evil man, however others may wish to paint you now."
"Others?" Anoman snorted. "You mean Elquist?" Caudrel merely shrugged as though he saw no need to confirm it.
"Did you know Sir Elquist has put out an order for your apprehension, Anoman? He wishes to speak to you about your recent alliances and how, by association, you have been bringing into disrepute the honor of the order's name. All know with whom you travel, and it has been decided since that she may be a less than virtuous influence upon your actions. Fritha has done nothing but battle to save this land. Do you forget I met her?
Snapped Caudrel.
Apart from an appalling taste in companionship, I found no fault to the girl. But, you must understand, Anomen, this war among the Ballspawn, it has drawn a very clear line between enemies and friends, and Sir Elquist and others higher up in both orders do not like to consider the tones of grey your companion presents. And what of us, Caudrel?
Challenged Anomen. If they were to fight, then let it be then when the old hatred was burning fierce.
Are we enemies now?
Caudrel heaved a weary sigh, though there was little else about his stance that spoke of defeat.
We were never friends, Anomen, and I do not pretend to be now, but...
He paused, struggling over the word as though it was hard for him to say.
I respect you. I don't agree with your decision to leave the order and rejoin your old group, but I respect you sacrificed everything to do what you believed was right. When we were squires, even after we were knighted, I thought your service to the order, even your faith was all the means to some personal glory. But you proved me wrong.
A hand reached absently for the small silver gauntlet of Torm that hung on a cord about his neck.
This land, seeing what I have seen, the empty farmsteads, that raid on Alhali, they make the old grudges seem so empty. Perhaps we were even meant to meet like this.
He paused again, and for longer this time, weighing something behind his eyes, and when Caudrel finally spoke there was a gravity to his tone. A decision had been made from which there was no going back.
I know why you left the order, Anomen, to seek out this five. You are here for the Ballspawn hidden within the Apogis. Sir Elquist and the other leaders are planning to march our forces west in a 10-day. They intercepted communications indicating the woman's plans to strike Memnon and are preparing thus. I believe she has baited her trap well. They think too much like generals. There are points of strategic importance to the west, the city, the coast, Higger's fort, but nothing that should tempt a Ballspawn. She will be after blood. Did you tell this to Elquist?
Asked Anomen.
Did he listen to you?
The man countered in a sneer.
If the orders are tricked to leave these towns undefended and march west, it will be a slaughter. If you mean to kill this Ballspawn, if you and your companions have some plan to end her, then act soon.
Anomen nodded. Only one thing remained between them now.
And what of my presence here? I will not lie to my superiors, but I doubt they will directly ask me if I saw you. Those squires will talk. No,
countered Caudrel,
they will not. I will order them not to. Some among us still know how to follow instruction.
He moved past him for the square, but stopped at the alley mouth, perhaps not wanting to leave on a rebuke, his half-turned face silhouetted against the market's glare.
Helm be with you. And Torm with you.
Caudrel stepped into the light and was gone. Anomen waited there in the shadows for a good while longer, trying to gather his tangled thoughts. Jahara was still at the stall where he had left her, the shield she had purchased slung across her back.
You are returned, Anomen. I must admit I was worried when that knight left the alley. I assume you managed to avoid him. No, I know him. We spoke.
Anomen confessed, the encounter still confusing enough to stilt his account.
Both the Radiant Heart and Silver Chalice are here. He told me, I can explain as we go. We need to get the rest of the supplies and leave here as soon as possible. Agreed, but first.
The woman nodded behind them to a large stall bearing baskets, hampers and a fine range of woven straw hats. Anomen felt his heart groan, it had come to this. Voices ahead, shouts lost to the crash of trampled undergrowth. Cellophane had been frowning for so long now he was getting a headache. For him, this should have been an exercise in centuries perfected stalking and his newly found woodland skills, but the soldiers they were following were so clamorous, he had no need of either. Perhaps it was an entire life in a culture that honed skills by survival, but he did not like it when others wandered blindly forward into the dangers of the land. It seemed disrespectful. Even Fritha moved more quietly than they, and he could tell she was hardly trying. The girl was a pace behind him now, moving through the undergrowth as carefully as she could with one eye always upon the canopy, her hat removed to facilitate the necessity and hung now on a cord across her shoulders. She noted him wince at one particularly loud halloo.
Noisy, aren't they? I am surprised every mercenary and drow in this forest is not here to welcome us.
Fritha merely shrugged.
They are probably just watching, waiting until we find the bodies of the other patrol and realize with terror that we are not alone before they strike, that is, according to every horror story I have ever read.
Cellophane failed to suppress the slight smile, his attention shifting to the broken fern now before them, fronds grazed and hanging limply from their stalks.
Their passage is not much masked either. Minsk has been teaching you how to track,
she confirmed without surprise.
Yes, my interest in the traps inspire it. They must be lane where animals pass, the signs of this no different from those men must leave, it merely takes practice to recognize them. My lady favors those who can hunt.
Fritha just nodded at first, pausing to edge along the rim of a wide dell. She had learned her lesson, it seemed.
And how is your lute playing going? Not as well, I confess. I have practiced little since we left Amkithran. I find myself preoccupied of an evening.
Her mouth opened, and he could sense in her the instinctive offer to help, to play duet that night or transcribe some music for him. But she stopped short, and perhaps she was not only speaking of his music as she offered blithely,
well, it can be good sometimes to take a break and learn something new. You have plenty of time to go back to your music.
He knew his expression was unreadable, and this was one of the few occasions where hers was the same.
Indeed,
he murmured, thinking to end it there, the words blurted from feelings he had believed quashed.
Though I will be ever grateful to you for first encouraging the skill in me.
Fritha just smiled and nodded, and he could not tell if she was pleased or saddened by what had been said. He was not sure himself. Whenever they did talk those days they either said nothing or spoke in circles. Her cheek was grazed from her fall and he wanted to ask her if it hurt. But he said nothing. He was not angry with Fritha, he was not anything, because he had snatched everything he had felt on the matter in an iron fist and buried it so deep he would never have to worry about it again. He was a drow, something that was only becoming more apparent the longer he spent from his homeland, and though the freedom to love and live was welcome, it seemed it had opened the path for other less desirable emotions. It had been foolish, why should she not seek the company of others if he would not oblige her? But however he had reasoned it away in recent days, it had done nothing to extinguish the fierce jealousy he had never before had a right to, and that had consumed him at the time. He had never had to deal with strong feelings, at least not freely, and the burning jealous anger when Fritha had told him, when he had watched her wave to that youth in the stables, had been dangerous. All that day he had been hot and cold, constantly snapping at Minsk. To look at her had been torture. But as unreasonable as he was being, he recognized the liability of holding such emotions when he had not the time or idea of how to work through them, and so he settled on the only method the darkness had taught. He had suppressed them and moved on.
They have quietened down,
offered Fritha to the silence between them, a nod to the last place they had seen their strident soldiers tramping through the trees. Cellophane scaled a nearby hillock of twisted roots for a better view.
Up ahead, they've stopped.
And the reason became clear as the pair crept closer to take cover in the ferns that grew all about the edge of the wide glade the soldiers were now milling about. How it was kept clear of either trees or undergrowth though, Cellophane could not guess. The mossy ground was split here and there by standing stones that seemed to form an uneven ring. Many of the man-sized obelisks had toppled, their moss-covered rubble scattered across the clearing in misshapen hillocks of green and grey.
"It's an old henge,"
whispered Fritha at his side.
"A holy site for druids."
He nodded once, eyes back on the clearing. The soldiers had found something on the other side. Cellophane leaned forward as far as he dared, straining to see past that confusion of men. They were parting the ferns on the edge to reveal a rocky fissure in the bank behind.
"Here, sir,"
one shouted.
"A way down through these rocks and, ugh!"
Cellophane caught the scent on the breeze an instant before Minsk confirmed it.
"Bodies!" "Jamal, Eden, light the torches, we..."
Sachem took a step into the fissure and the glade exploded about them. 6 of the uneven boulders that littered the clearing had sprang up, long legs sprouting from in thick black roots, Fritha's cry lost in the uproar.
"Spiders! They're everywhere! Keep together!"
roared Sachem, a voice of authority in the building panic as the spiders darted in. The first leapt forward, a barrage of crossbow bolts leaving his face little more than mush, some soldiers hurrying to reload while others drew instead their blades. The remaining spiders moved as one, edging forward to surround them. When one broke ranks to leap up, webs spat to the branches above to see it swinging overhead. A chorus of panicked screams from the soldiers. Cellophane grabbed Fritha's arm as the girl's first instinct saw her almost darting from the undergrowth to help them.
"It's above us! Run! I said keep together!"
A roar bellowed over the panic. Minsk, pounding up the bank to leap for the creature broadsword brought down in a sweep that cut the spider both down and through. So decisive a kill seemed to rally the others, the soldiers pressing their own attack, pairing off to surround and overwhelm the creatures. The last creature fell with a shriek and one by one the panting men sheathed blades and maces and returned to the grim task of excavating bodies both old and fresh from the spider's underground nest. Cellophane watched them line the rotting husks as neatly as they could amongst the carnage.
"Those spiders, there is something familiar about them. The way they camouflaged themselves and hunted as a pack. Like an underdark breed,"
said Fritha. It was not a question, but he nodded anyway. In the clearing, the soldiers were picking over the bodies, trying to sort their comrades from the older corpses. Fritha watched Minsk make an examination of the largest spider. He looked disturbed.
"Any brought with Sendai would not have had time to interbreed with local spiders,"
she murmured absently.
"They must have been here for generations. And that means there is likely a way down into the Underdark nearby, perhaps even a few dotted about this forest."
Fritha sat back on her haunches with a sigh.
So Sendai did not merely come to the Apogis to hide her army, she could have emerged here months ago. And be all the more deeply rooted for it, as well as having a way of escape only a fool would follow her in.
"Yes," Fritha agreed grimly,
"but if she plans to march on Balthazar, she will have to leave at some point."
Back in the clearing, one of the soldiers had uncovered an unwelcome truth.
"That body, that's Kilton. He was supposed to have left to run a message for the chalice to Zaeper a 10-day back. Why was he even in here? Look, here, Jamal. His throat's been cut. Maybe those mercs got him on the road and then dumped his body in the forest when they were done." And what in hells do I tell his wife? She expects his return any day now. Those bastard mercs!
Jamal vented his anger on the nearest spider corpse, a furious kick sending the severed half of its bloody abdomen airborne, the hunk of dead flesh arcing up to explode against the tree just behind, showering them in gore. Fritha's hand over her mouth did little to mute the shrill squeak.
What was that?
Within the ferns, two faces whipped to each other in dawning horror.
It came from the bushes. If you can understand me, step out now.
An instant for each to weigh the risks to the other, and they were suddenly locked, hands upon each other's shoulders and each struggling against the other, fighting to prevent their friend from rising.
I warn you now, step out.
Somewhere outside the thicket, the slide and click of loaded crossbows. For an instant, the struggle intensified, Solafane using his strength to force her down, and he was nearly away from her when...
Please, don't shoot!
Fritha cried, as shrilly as any young damsel in danger. Solafane stopped. Fritha was smiling, the smug quirk her lips almost daring him to stand now. 3 words saw her released in mulish defeat, the drow slumping back to the soft earth, while she pulled on her hat to struggle to her feet.
"Hey girl!"
someone gasped warily. The crossbows had yet to be lowered, the men still tense from the fight, Fritha gazing wide-eyed about that ring of swords and distrust.
"Who in hells are you?"
demanded Sachem. Fritha did the only thing she could do, and promptly burst into tears. Minsk saw his cue.
"Oh, what is this, young maid?"
he boomed over her noisy sobs.
"Do not fear us, we mean you no harm, is that not so, good Sachem?"
"Why, yes, of course," the lieutenant agreed, seemingly flustered at the way matters were quickly spiraling from the familiar.
"We mean you no harm, girl. Now, why you were following us?" My brother went to hunt in the forest 2 days ago,"
Fritha hiccuped valiantly,
"and he hasn't come back."
With her hat on she likely passed for a human, the girl holding her scabbard awkwardly away from her side as though scared it would tangle about her legs.
"I took my father's old sword and came to look for him. I knew it was dangerous, but I just couldn't leave him. But I came in too far and got lost, and when I saw you soldiers I followed you. I just wanted to find my way back home." "Oh, there now, do not weep,"
soothed Minsk, beckoning the girl forward to place a paternal arm about her shoulders.
"The threat is over now. Here, is your brother among these dead?"
Fritha sniffed plaintively and shook her head.
"Well, then perhaps there is a chance he lives, yes? These soldiers are heading now to Halzik, is that where you live?" "No,"
she ventured tremulously,
"I'm from a farm to the east, just on the forest's edge."
Minsk beamed.
"Well, then, Boo and I will escort you home. You can find the way back alone."
The question was posed to the lieutenant, Sachem starting at the sudden address.
Well,
he clearly wanted to question the girl further, but he was equally reluctant to speak against Minsk, and his hesitation was being noted, his men shifting restlessly about him. An instant longer left to flounder before pride won out.
"We can find our way back,"
he assured Minsk almost sharply, fingers smoothing his thick mustache.
"Though you will have to attend the barracks as well to collect the payment I promised." No,
the ranger dismissed.
"To patrol the forest thus is my duty. Keep your gold. Come now, young maid,"
he continued to Fritha and making to lead the way eastwards.
"Be careful of the routes here. I will speak to your family when we arrive, and perhaps I can search for your brother, yes."
Solafane watched them go, waiting for the men to return to the bodies before he ventured to follow, keeping his movements low and quick within the undergrowth. It seemed his skills would not be untested after all.
And that other one you suggested,
snapped Imoen,
the ABC of magic, or whatever it was. It was Dialini's Arcane Primer,
retorted Valigar,
and it is book you will find in many mages' libraries. Yeah, from when they were apprentices. Something which you freely admit you never were. It contains some essential cantrips for miscasting protection and a passage on spell control. I was trying to help fill the gaps in your training, starting with the fundamentals.
A no-man let the noise of their squabble drift over him with the warm afternoon breeze. It seemed Valigar's reasons for making the highly surprising suggestion to visit Halkis' magic quarter and encouraging anyone in their pursuit of the art were now laid bare, and his attempts to re-educate Imoen from the basics up had not gone down well with the girl. The pair had been arguing since long before they had met him and Jaheira at the town gates 2 hours ago, and it showed no signs of ending any time soon. Every now and then, a stony silence would fall between the pair, then one would remember something else and the whole argument would have to be gone over again most vociferously. Lonely as he had been at points in his life, listening to it made a no-man glad he had no lady.
The others are returned,
came a quieter voice next to him, and he turned in time to see Jaheira nod to the frail tendril of smoke that was rising into the amber sky from the gully he knew was still hidden by the long grass. A no-man's stomach made his answer for him, and he realized with its growl that he had not eaten since breakfast. As soon as the thought occurred, and it was as though all the energy left his bones. All he wanted that evening was to sit by a fire with those who knew him and share a meal.
And what were you speaking so long about with that bookseller? Even when you sent me off to buy some salted bread, I returned to find you still there. I told you, we were just talking. I didn't buy anything, check my pack if you don't believe me. And leaving that tome with the Wind Rider carriers at the shrine to Shindakul, I thought you had bought that book from Master Omir. I did, but for the price they would buy it for here, I thought he might like it back. Ilmater's bleeding heart. I was trying to be nice.
And to be far away from those two.
You are quiet, a no-man,
offered Jaheira. He could not refute it. He had already told her all Kadril had said and the added pressure of time the knights presented. If the orders moved their combined forces against Sendai before they found her, it could force the Drow to move, to go to ground, even to march her army, and all their plans would be thrown into the air.
I have little to say. I only hope the others have had more success than we have.
Jaheira glanced to the wide-brimmed straw hat that was hanging on a cord across his shoulders resting upon the pack he bore, the shield he had bought for Valigar hidden within, and a no-man suspected he looked just like any other traveler.
You have known a long while that you have been expelled from the order,
the druid confirmed at length.
He sighed, long enough and the wound is healed, as much as it can be. Have no worries there, Jaheira.
Ahead, the yellow scar of the gully was splitting the plains and they reached the edge to find the others below as Jaheira had predicted. Solifane and Minsk were busying themselves over a pair of rabbits their traps had caught during the day, while Fritha was laid out on one side of the fire, drawing eager mouthfuls from her open flask and enjoying the last of the sunshine. Her cheeks seemed flushed and he wondered if she had caught the sun, the girl waving as she saw them to sit with an earnest look, and he knew then both groups would have a story to tell that evening. Minsk was there to help them with their laden packs by the time they had picked their way down the rocky slope. Jaheira already stooped over her own pulling out flatbreads and dried meat while shouting for water to be readied and the fire built up. To a no-man's weary body, her barked orders were a song.
How was it?
Asked Fritha from the pile of firewood she was deliberately laying stick by stick upon the building flames.
Humph!
From Imoen told her all she needed to know regarding one aspect of their trip, Jahara continuing more helpfully,
smoothly enough, and we have supplies now for over a 10-day if we are frugal, though Anomen was recognized by the local delegation of knights. By the silver chalice.
No, he admitted,
by Sir Caudrel. The order has joined again with the chalice, though he assured me he would not tell them of my presence here. Apparently, I have been labeled a recreant, and should expect fitting treatment if discovered.
A quirk to her brow and slight purse of her lips were the only things to betray the guilt Fritha likely felt.
I'm sorry to hear that,
she sighed eventually, drawing one last mouthful and screwing closed her flask.
You're back no sooner for it though, this happened just before you left. No, a short time after we arrived at the marketplace actually. And you stayed there with such a risk of being seen.
The girl cried, astounded glare thrown between him and Jahara as though she did not know who to explode at first. Anomen fought against a smile.
There was little risk, Fritha, Jahara saw to that.
He ducked slightly, drawing over his head and tossing to her the wide-brimmed hat from where it had been hidden behind his broad shoulders. Fritha threw a jubilant laugh to the sky.
Aha! Another joins our ranks, Solafane. Indeed,
the drow quipped,
perhaps you can even aspire to a bounty.
Anomen snorted, catching it easily as Fritha tossed it back to him.
I hear they only reserve those for the best of us. Ah, 'tis true,
Fritha sighed.
You have to be something very wicked to get a bounty. Still, don't give up, I'll get you there yet. Come,
laughed Jahara, giving the girl's shoulder a fond slap.
Let us serve out this tea and share our tales of the day.
End of chapter.